Good evening and welcome once again to the Lepanto Institute's Anchor Team. I'm your host, Michael Hishborn, and with me is my lovely bride, Alyssa. And we've got a pretty packed program for you this evening. It's been a really busy week for us at the Lepanto Institute, so we're going to get into some of the stuff that we've been working on as well. But before we get into any of that, we're going to go ahead and start with our prayer. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Our Lady of Victory.
Pray for us.
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right. So a couple of things that I want to go over first. Just so that you guys know, we are continuing to roll out organizations that we've been investigating for the last 6 months that are getting money from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. I just before coming in for a little bite to eat and then rushing downstairs to get things going, I finished putting together a report on a group called CTUL, which is a Spanish acronym for something. It's like Centro de Trabajadores, I don't know, something in Spanish. But the organization, I mean, they're thoroughly Marxists. I mean, it's a no-brainer. They're a bunch of communists. So female Casey Royals fan asks, where did the St. Michael statue come from? That was actually a Christmas gift to Alyssa. I picked it up at Church Militant. They have an online store there, and you can get one just like it if you go to their online store. So anyway, I finished. It's a long report. I mean, there's a lot of information there. I wound up watching some videos that were done by their collaborating partners on a few things, and it's just, after a while, you see just some vile stuff, and the world just is awful. I'm so ready to get off. But anyway, so we just put that report up today. And the report that we put up earlier this week is on an organization called SPYS, SPYS, which stands for St. Paul Youth Services. And that organization is pushing transgender ideology on kids. And the executive director of the organization, the one who has all the interaction with all the kids, is a big-time LGBT activist, promotes Planned Parenthood and a bunch of awfulness on social media. So that's another organization that shouldn't be receiving any funding. So those are the two things that we put out this week. And then there are a couple of other articles. You can go to the website and you can see those articles. I also mentioned them in our newsletter, so that kind of catches you up on where we are. So why don't we jump into the leading topic of the day, and then we'll cover some other news items. And I actually got some questions from you guys that Alyssa and I are going to try and answer as well. So the first and foremost, let's hit the topic of the evening. Pope Francis was in Kazakhstan. So what happened there, Mrs. Hitchborn?
Well, he was at a meeting. Is this the one in the pyramid?
Yes.
The glass pyramid. Yeah, he spent a lot of time praising the architecture of Kazakhstan, and it took me a minute to realize he probably meant the glass pyramid they were in. Anyway, they were having a meeting, and he gave an address wherein he did not mention the name of Jesus. He did not quote the Bible. He did not say anything that might be considered offensive or non-inclusive to, well, what's frankly a large Muslim population in Kazakhstan and others, using kind of generic phrases like the divine or the Lord, but not really saying like who he meant, the Christian God, of course. And certainly giving the impression, as Bishop Athanasius Schneider later put it, that Catholicism was just a part of the supermarket of religions.
Oh, supermarket of religions.
Yes, instead of the one true faith. This was Schneider's
interpretation of events.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah.
The name of the event was the 7th Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions. That's kind of a mouthful. But the this thing has been going on. This is the 7th such event that they've had, but their whole point, the whole purpose of the meeting is for these leaders of various religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Lutheranism, you name it. They were Muslims, Jews, and the Pope, of course. And so the whole point is, well, we're all these religious leaders and we're coming together. We're coming together for the purpose of peace. And we want to help make peace in the world. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by, first of all, not beating each other up. So we're not going to go after each other, you Muslims and you wily Buddhists and Hindus. We're just going to be buddy-buddy. That's step 1. Step 2 is that we're going to try and push for a system that by which the world governments can come together and initiate peace following the leadership of these religious movements, because, matter follows form. So if the form is the religious movements coming together and we're going to have peace and we're not going to fight each other anymore, then you governments can all play along and be buddy chums, and it's going to be great. And at the end of the day, they start calling for United Nations reforms and United Nations programs and the United Nations leadership and how we need to have these international bodies come together. Did you get a chance to read some of the statements that came out of the meeting?
I read more of what he said in an interview afterward on the flight back to Rome with the reporters.
Okay.
So in that, he was asked a lot of questions, and his thing he kept coming back to was dialogue. He said, he didn't name a name, but he said somebody there in Kazakhstan, which of course had to be Bishop Schneider. He's like, has accused me of relativism. And he said that couldn't be farther from the truth. He's like, this is all just about, like, we talk to each other and we dialogue, and I ask you what your opinion is and you hear mine, but we each keep our own faith tradition. We just get to know something about each other. He's like, how is that relativism? And then meanwhile, like just a few paragraphs later, going on to explain how relativism is one of the things destroying Europe.
Yeah.
When asked a different question from another reporter. So it sounds like probably at this Congress, it was just the usual kind of empty blather. And it's just I guess the news item is that the leader of the worldwide Catholic Church, billion Catholics, can't say anything about Catholicism.
This is true.
He's too busy quoting, what did he quoted a local poet and Muslim. He quoted him about a fifth of his speech, calling him a very noble soul. But he had nothing to say about Christianity.
Oh, and nothing to say about what any of the saints have said or anything about what some of the doctors of the church had said. It seems like it's par for the course. When I look at the declaration that was signed, it reminded me very much of the Abu Dhabi statement.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that apparently what was read aloud at the meeting was not the same thing as what was published on the website. There was one change. I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to give you a sense of what this thing was about. And this declaration of the 7th Congress of the Leaders of World and Traditional Religions says this, or at least this is how it opens. It says, we, the participants of the 7th Congress, spiritual leaders of world and traditional religions, politicians, heads of international organizations, guided by our desire for a just, peaceful, secure, and prosperous world. What do they mean by prosperous? It's a rhetorical question. Affirming the importance of shared values in the spiritual and social development of humankind, recognizing the necessity of countering and overcoming intolerance and hate speech, xenophobia, discrimination, and conflicts of ethnic, religious, and cultural differences. respecting the richness of religious and cultural diversity. And it goes on and on in that same light. I mean, even affirming the importance of the role and rights of women in society. I mean, these are all double entendres that could have multiple meanings. What do we mean by the rights of women? Well, as Catholics, we mean, hey, Muslims, stop raping women. Or, hey, Muslims, stop performing female circumcisions. You know, this is what we mean from a Catholic perspective. But, you know, from a secular perspective, they had political leaders there. Couldn't they also mean abortion, contraception, sterilization? When they talk about diversity and they talk about rights for all, couldn't they also mean LGBT rights? So there's no specificity in anything that's said in the document. It's just this amorphous hot air. It's garbage. But the one thing I want to focus on, and this goes back to the Abu Dhabi statement, point 10, because this is where they have the declarations. We have come to the common position and declare the following. And so they talk about getting together, strengthening their efforts and fighting the pandemic and trying to, you know, stop militarism and war and conflict and that kind of thing. But at point 10, it says, and this is the public statement. The public statement says, we note that pluralism in terms of differences in skin, color, gender, race, language, and culture are expressions of the wisdom of God in creation. Religious diversity is permitted by God, and therefore any coercion to a particular religion and religious doctrine is unacceptable. There are a couple of problems with this. The first is that this idea that religious diversity is permitted by God, and therefore any coercion to a particular religion and religious doctrine is unacceptable, seems to indicate that evangelization is bad, don't you think?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the point, isn't it? Like, that's why they were so surprised that Shia LaBeouf converted to Catholicism, because of the old mass. They're just scratching their heads. They can't understand why people do it, because they don't really engage in evangelization. And they push the same kind of tired things over and over again, and then wonder why the churches are emptying. I mean, Pope Francis has said multiple times on different occasions things like, we can't hold to the old tired ways. That's not going to attract people to the church. We have to let the Spirit, you know, be the one to move things. That's what makes people Catholic, but then never really sets out what that looks like.
Right.
Like, how does the Spirit move people to join the Catholic Church? Like, does that mean that therefore our work here is done? We don't have to do any evangelization? Because apparently it's bad to do it. You know, if you're, it's almost like you're suggesting there's something less about what you believe, and that I have something better. Well, and they don't want to say that.
I think the key to it is that this idea of coercion to a particular religion. Now, obviously, when we try to evangelize, we're not trying to coerce anybody. I mean, when you think about coercion, you think about wrenching their arm behind their back and squeezing until they yell uncle. That's usually what we think of when we think of in terms of coercion. But coercion in this respect seems to mean specifically evangelistic efforts. And the reason I say that is because this statement about coercion to a particular religion is predicated on the previous portion of the sentence. Religious diversity is permitted by God. Therefore, any coercion to a particular religion. So, at least in my read of it, and maybe I'm wrong, but according to my read of it, it seems to be saying that because God allows the diversity of religions, you shouldn't be working to make converts because God permits this, right?
I mean, it seems like it. I mean, even Pope Francis said when he was asked questions on this interview about Nicaragua, and he said, "Oh, good news, the missionaries of charity, I mean, should be allowed back in the country. You know, they're doing good work there." The point being, like, the missionaries of charity, they take care of, you know, the poorest of the poor, but they don't, like, they live by example, but it's not their charism to go out and like, preach to people.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's this idea again of stepping back a little bit and not being a preaching faith.
Right.
When
Right.
was the last time we encouraged like missionary orders to go into countries to bring things about? It's really not something that's a big part of the Vatican II Church. Again, that idea that if we're all kind of equal, then I have no place to try to convince you that you're believing something that's insufficient.
Well, and in addition to that, it seems to me that, I mean, how many times have we heard Pope Francis say, you know, you shouldn't be going out and proselytizing? It's more of the same kind of rhetoric that he seems to be using, and now he's agreeing with this idea that, hey, yeah, don't go out and make converts. I remember when the Anglican archbishop, and I can't remember what his name was, but when he converted to the Catholic faith, and Pope Francis apparently reached out to him personally and said, "Oh, you don't have to do that."
Oh yeah, they were flummoxed when he
Yeah,
did.
right. And he said, "No, I want the fullness of the faith. I'm coming over. Why are you trying to stop me?" And it's I think the reason is that at the end of the day, you can't have pluralism and this idea of a syncretistic religious society if anyone is worthy of moving over toward. So conversions actually build on the idea that, hey, there's one that has something that's superior to the rest. And so I'm going to go over here because their ideologies are actually better than the ones that I was in. And with the Catholic faith, obviously what we mean by that is the sacraments.
Yeah, but I mean, like all players of this game, the tired modernist game, they always dance on the line. They never go full bore and say, "Oh no, 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 we weren't saying you shouldn't become Catholic," or "No, no, we weren't saying you shouldn't, you should have some syncretist religion." We just meant the spirit should move people, and we shouldn't try to force them with our tired catechisms and our old ways.
Right.
Right? They always stop short on the line of really, dipping right out and saying, "Oh yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or not." Because if they ever did that, it's like, well, then what's your relevance?
Right.
Why should
Right.
anyone listen to the words you're saying right now if it doesn't matter? If I could be whatever we want and we're all going to go to a good place, then what does it matter what we believe?
And of course, going back to the Abu Dhabi statement, the first part of this document or the statement here, we note that pluralism in terms of differences in skin color, race, language, and culture are expressions of the wisdom of God in creation. This is not what was read aloud at the meeting. And that's what's very interesting, because what was read aloud at the meeting, and I don't have the exact words in front of me, but I did see them earlier. What was read aloud was that God wills the plurality of gender, race, language, religion.
But at the
The way,
Kazakhstan meeting?
yes, yes, it was in this meeting that God wills the plurality of these things in creation, which is to say that God himself wills a diversity of religious beliefs. And I mean, that's heresy. And that was actually what was in the Abu Dhabi statement that Pope Francis had signed before. It was in the document that they read aloud and signed at the meeting, but then the language changed for the online version. So now the question
Hmm.
remains, how does this play out for Pope Francis then? Because the wording, if you read the document now, the way I read it to you, it sounds like they tried to change the wording in order to walk it back so that it couldn't quite be interpreted the way that it obviously was intended to be with the original statement, with the Abu Dhabi statement. But what does this mean for Pope Francis? I mean, if Pope Francis signed this thing with the first meaning, which is that God directly wills the plurality of religions, the same way that he willed everything in creation. I mean, that would be twice that he had signed something like that. And it would also indicate that he's promoting heresy. So that there are two questions here. What does it mean if he signed that as it was read aloud at the meeting? And then what does it mean for them to have changed the statement on the website?
They'll claim it was a translation error.
I think you're right.
They'll just say it's a translation error. And then once again, you're in that like dancing on the line. Oh, that's not what I meant, or I meant X. Like it's the same thing. It's the same tired thing. I mean, Mahoney was a master of this. They all are. Like they would never come right out and just blatantly say heresy.
Right.
They always dance on the line and then gaslight anybody who says, gosh, that sounds an awful lot like it.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of dancing on the line of heresy, I do want to bring up this this article from LifeSite News where, let me see if I can pull it up real quick.
I think I have it up too.
Go LifeSite News. There we go. So LifeSite News published an article saying that, and it's very interesting because several bishops, priests, theologians,
scholars
signed a statement saying that that document that Pope Francis put out a couple of months ago, how do you pronounce it? Desiderio. That statement contains a line of heresy. So you and I were talking about it just a little bit ago, and had you read that story yet? Had you?
So I guess the big quote that they focused on was, it says, quote, everyone is invited to the supper of the wedding of the Lamb. To be admitted to the feast, all that is required is the wedding garment of faith, which comes from the hearing of his word.
Right.
So the Pope wrote those words in the letter that was published June 29th. And the signatories of the statement claim he omitted the essential topic of repentance for sin for the worthy reception of the Eucharist, meaning like, well, all you need to get into the wedding feast is a wedding garment, and that's your faith. So as long as you have faith, then you could present yourself for communion, which of course would open you up to a lot of, issues, obviously, like, don't Protestants have faith? Don't they believe in Jesus? Can't they come to communion? I mean, it opens up a lot of problems, which is why the signatories wrote what they did. But I think you took a slightly nuanced idea to, or reaction to it, I should say.
Yes. So I actually pulled up the document itself because I wanted to see exactly what was said and in what context. It's always very important, especially if you're going to accuse the Pope of heresy, to read everything before and after the stated quote so that you can get the proper context. And I think, it's pretty obvious what his intention was. He gave Holy Communion to Nancy Pelosi and he chastised Archbishop Cordileone, whom you and I met a couple of nights ago. But he chastised Archbishop Cordileone as being unpastoral because he denied her Holy Communion, ordered that she be denied Holy Communion. So it seems that in that context, and Pope Francis himself even said, I've never denied anybody Holy Communion, which again seems to affirm that that's his intention in the statement. However, the statement itself, I think, has enough of a veneer on it to hide its intended blemish. And I'll read to you just a little bit, and then we can talk about it. Paragraph 5 of his document says this: the world still does not know it, but everyone is invited to the supper of the wedding of the Lamb. To be admitted to the feast, all that is required is the wedding garment of faith, which comes from the hearing of the word. So if you hear the word, you have faith, and therefore you can go to the feast, apparently. The church tailors such a document to fit each one of these witnesses of a garment bathed in the blood of the Lamb. We must not allow ourselves even a moment of rest, knowing that still not everyone has received an invitation to this supper, or knowing that others have forgotten it or have got lost along the way in the twists and turns of human living. This is what I spoke of when I said, quote, I dream of a missionary option. That is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self preservation. I want this so that all can be seated at the supper of the Lamb and live from him. What's your take on that particular passage?
Well, once again, it sounds like the church doesn't matter, that we don't want to suit things for the church, but for the world. And to get everybody there, it's like we have to water down the things that are more Catholic, that might, present obstacles to people to get there.
Yeah. As I read the statement, it's wordy enough that it hides exactly what it is he's trying to say. Because when he uses euphemisms like invitation to the wedding of the Lamb, what does that mean? Are you talking about the Mass? Are you talking about reception of Holy Communion? Are you talking about being a full member and participant of the Catholic Church? What does he even mean by this? To have the invitation, and then to go to the supper, the wedding feast of the Lamb. It's really, I think it's unclear as to whether he means communion or the Mass, and they're not the same. You can't say that reception of communion is equal to going to Mass, because you can do one without the other.
Well, again, the signatories to the letter calling out the heresy certainly interpreted it as saying the Eucharist.
Mhm.
That's what they're calling him out for. That he's suggesting that somebody like Pelosi could receive communion as long as she has faith, right? The divorced and remarried can receive communion as long as they have faith.
Mhm.
Protestants can receive communion as long as they have faith. Well, frankly, LGBTQ people can receive communion as long as they have faith.
Right.
That's certainly how the signatories of the letter, kind of the rebuke of him, interpreted it.
And I don't think they're wrong in their interpretation. My concern is that it can be interpreted another way, and that Pope Francis's apologists will be able to use that as a bludgeon against good bishops Strickland and Gracida and the others, because they can turn around and say, no, the wedding of the Lamb, the feast of the wedding of the Lamb, doesn't mean communion necessarily. It probably means just the Mass. However, I think that the
that
second,
doesn't make sense, though, because anybody, any person of goodwill could attend a Mass. And now, like, we don't need the
right,
Pope's permission. Anybody, an atheist, a Jew, anybody who wants to go sit in a Mass just to see what's going on is welcome to do it. So that doesn't seem like that could be the interpretation either, because then why make a whole document about it? Because that's already true.
so the paragraph before that, so paragraph 4 says this: no one had earned a place at the supper. All had been invited, or better said, all had been drawn there by the burning desire that Jesus had to eat the Passover with them. He knows that he is the lamb of that Passover meal. He knows that he is the Passover. This is the absolute newness, the absolute originality of the supper. The only truly new thing in history that renders that supper unique, and for this reason, the Last Supper unrepeatable. Unrepeatable? I think actually that's a heresy, because, well,
Hold on, because we represent the sacrifice, but we don't
mhm.
repeat it in its bloody fashion.
Right.
It's a
But it's not.
representation.
But the Last Supper isn't actually what's represented at the Mass anyway. It's the unbloody sacrifice at Calvary.
Well, then we have to get into meal versus sacrifice, which is
Mhm.
all the rage these days.
And then it goes on. It says, nonetheless, his infinite desire to reestablish that communion with us was and remains his original design, will not be satisfied until every man and woman, from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, shall have eaten his body and drunk his blood. And for this reason, that same supper will be made present in the celebration of the Eucharist until he returns again. So again, he's using a lot of euphemisms and he's dancing around the topic. And I think it's very hard to pin him down specifically on saying that going to the sacrifice or to the supper of the Lamb is equal to receiving Holy Communion. I think that's his intention, but he doesn't quite say it, you know?
I don't know. His language is pretty indicative, speaking specifically about eating and people receiving the body and blood of Christ. And, he's not going to come again until everybody has. Like, that language sounds very leading.
Very, very. And I completely agree. And I think that, again, I don't know that a statement of condemnation would be warranted so much as a dubia to say, Your Holiness, do you mean that nobody is to be denied Holy Communion? Is that what you mean by this? And this is actually the purpose of a dubia, but we all know how that goes. When was the last time he answered a dubia? Oh, wait, it had to do with the traditional Latin Mass.
Well, and once again, they don't want to be cornered and give clear answers. They'd rather say things that are ambiguous, and then they let you know where they are by who they censure and who they don't.
Yes.
So Wilton Gregory handing out communion to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi willy-nilly, but he doesn't get any kind of public commentary from the bishop. Rather, Cordileone does, not by name, right, but he says some people aren't very pastoral.
Right.
Like, here he is holding up canon law, but no, I'm going to basically sneer about it. So you can see where they're at, but again, they're very careful. They're very careful to craft public statements that are on record that are more ambiguous. That's the way they get away with stuff. But what they're about.
Yeah, and they're hypocrites too. And I'll go ahead and say it, that Pope Francis himself is a hypocrite, because what's happening here is at the same time that he says these people are not being pastoral, and that if a church that is not pastoral, and I can't remember the exact quote, he said something about a church that's not pastoral, it's bad somehow. But what does that mean then for the denial of the traditional Latin Mass to those who desire it, who desire to attend the wedding of the Lamb, the feast of the wedding of the Lamb? I mean, how can he in the same mindset say this is forbidden and be so rigid about it, but then to turn around and say, oh, but everybody should come to the celebration of the feast of the wedding of the Lamb and be welcome, and not, we don't want to deny anybody.
The celebration of the Novus Ordo.
Right.
We want everybody to come to that. That's the only expression of the wedding feast of the Lamb in his interpretation.
So then here's the hypocrisy though, because what happens to those, and this is an honest question for anybody out there, what happens if a priest, a bishop, or whomever turns and says, you know what, Holy Father, I'm not following this. Your Traditionis Custodes document is garbage. I'm going to allow every priest to say the traditional Latin Mass in my diocese, and I'm not going to deny them the ability to do this. In fact, I'm going to stand in the way of anybody that tries to shut them down. So then what does Pope Francis do in a situation like that? He only has a few options. He can excommunicate everybody who fails to follow his edict, or he can remove the bishop, or he can try and force him into retirement. But there really isn't a whole lot that he could do. But by taking action against a bishop in a circumstance like that, while then telling everybody else, we want everybody to go to communion, including the LGBT, including pro-aborts, including non-Christians. We want everybody there. Isn't he basically saying that, well, I'm now dividing what we think the Catholic Church is into two different religions? I mean, isn't that ultimately where this goes?
I think it's more a matter of, we've talked about this on previous anchor teams. It's just the slow smothering of the traditional movement with the intent of the eradication of it. Oh, I mean, I guess we can't judge intent, but that's certainly what Roche and others have stated, is that this is a phasing out of the traditional Latin Mass. So I think for them, they just look at it like, well, sorry, patient with cancer doesn't always like the cure, but we got to do it for the good of the body, right? We got to cut out the cancer of this traditionalism for the good of the body, and then all will be welcome, right? Because it's those pesky trads. They're always the ones talking about sin and morality and standards,
right?
And, once we kind of divide and conquer them, get their numbers so small, put them in gyms, whatever, then eventually we can just say, now you're outlawed. And anybody who does it is excommunicated or in schism or whatever, as the case may be.
And then, of course, you've got the situation in in Washington, D.C., talking about reception of Holy Communion, worthily or unworthily. Archbishop Wilton Gregory has apparently put down an edict that all of his priests are now instructed that if Joe Biden presents himself for Holy Communion in their parish, that they are to give him Holy Communion. And I saw, and you and I talked about this, I saw that some of those priests have pushed back and said, if we get word from the Secret Service that Joe Biden is coming to our parish for Mass, we won't distribute communion at all. Which,
well, good for them.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody needs to figure out where their backbone is and what hill they're going to die on, because
I think that is the hill to die on.
But that's the problem with weaponized ambiguity. Like, you never know what the hill is you're supposed to be dying on, because the person can always say, oh, no, you misunderstood. That's not what I meant. Nobody knows what the hill is. So, but somebody who says, give this loser Holy Communion, that's a pretty clear hill.
That's a pretty clear hill. Yeah. So let's move on to...
Oh, sorry. Were you going to talk about the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage tomorrow?
I might as well.
Since we're on this sort of theme.
Yeah. I will be attending the Summorum Pontificum march tomorrow from Arlington to Washington, D.C. It's a 5-mile walk, which I hope my feet survive. But because I'll be wearing dress shoes. But I'll be bringing my...
Ooh, dress shoes.
Well,
can't you wear your sensible shoes for 5 miles?
Dude. Yeah, I'll think about it. But I'll be bringing my son Sebastian with me, and the two of us are going to be marching up there, and hopefully we'll see a whole lot of other people participating. And if any of you are in the area, come join us. We'll be starting at St. Thomas the Apostle in Arlington, and we'll be walking to, I don't know the location, but we'll be walking up there. And if you can't join us, at least join us in prayer. We'll be praying the rosary, I think, pretty much the entire way. So that's a lot of rosaries. Yeah. Why don't we move on to some of the articles that you were able to pull up for us, and I will turn the floor to you as you start off with one of the stories.
Okay. Let's see. We covered all of that. Okay. So some of the interesting ones on the political realm, I guess we could talk about then, would be DeSantis, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, flying illegal immigrants from San Antonio to Florida to Martha's Vineyard in up there in New England, which, of course, the White House and residents of Martha's Vineyard are calling a political stunt.
Oh, that's a political stunt.
It's a political stunt, although he claims he and the governors of like Texas and Arizona are like, hey, listen, it's you, Biden's immigration policy, open borders. They said, I think more illegal immigrants have surged in, like it's in the millions, like since Biden took office. And so they're like, you guys have all these great ideas calling yourselves sanctuary cities, but you're not bearing the brunt of what it looks like on the ground. You know, we are. And they can send, do you know this? They can send illegal aliens from Mexico back to Mexico, but if they come from another country, they can't send them to Mexico. So if there's So if there's Venezuelans, you know, anybody from another South American country, they can't send them to Mexico if they cross the border. They have to do something with them.
Most of them are undocumented, so how would they know?
I don't know. But I mean, for example, the ones they sent up to Martha's Vineyard, I think, are Venezuelans.
Oh, interesting. So that means they can't be sent back to Mexico. They have to be sent back to Venezuela.
Correct. And I don't think that there's any kind of policy or plan in place in the Biden administration, certainly, to do that. So again, Governor Abbott, Governor DeSantis, the governor of Arizona, they're like, okay, so they're basically flooding into our, you know, states, creating not just humanitarian issues, but, you know, who's going to take care of them, pay for them? What about the drugs a lot of them are bringing in? Well, how about you guys deal with it? Since you think it's so great to have open borders, why don't you see what open borders looks like?
And of course, Catholic Charities is one of the primary agencies helping these people to get across the border, including the drug runners and the gangbangers and so forth.
Yeah, to be clear, they're not all drug runners. You know, some of them are just people trying to get to a better life. But again, you know, there's a process for that.
Right.
Right. I also thought it was funny that Governor Greg Abbott actually he sent 2 buses from Texas to the Washington neighborhood, not far where Vice President Kamala Harris's official residence is.
Oh, wow.
He did that on Thursday.
Wow. That's well, you know, I got to hand it to these governors. It's pretty ingenious for them to decide that, well, if they're going to make it our problem, why don't we go ahead and make it theirs? And then, of course, Lori Lightfoot out in Chicago turns around and she gets all flustered and says that this is, you know, this is horrible what they did by sending them to Chicago. And Greg Abbott turned right around and said, excuse me, Chicago is a sanctuary city. You declared yourselves a sanctuary city for all these refugees. We're just taking them straight to you because that's what you said you wanted.
Well, then she, of course, bussed them out to a city in Illinois controlled by a Republican mayor.
Yep. So now we're playing hot potato with a bunch of immigrants.
Yes. Although DeSantis and apparently the Florida legislature, they've approved $12 million in money to, again, transport illegal aliens to other states.
12 million. Wow.
12 million. So I don't know if that includes any money to, like, you know, probably it includes money to do things like temporary housing, food, you know, medical checkups, whatever, and then, you know, transport them. I'm sure that maybe that's part of it. But I mean, they're getting serious about it. It's like if Biden and Kamala Harris are going to have open borders, well, then we're all going to share the love, you know, not just the people who are on the actual border.
So here's a question for you. And this is another switch in topic here. You have a headline here: Democrats and their allies attempt to pass redefinition of marriage bill in the Senate. Was that done today, or are they still pending the vote?
It's still pending.
Okay.
So the news article that came out today was they're trying to sweeten sweeten the pill for the Republicans. They need 10 Republican senators to switch over in order to get it to pass in the Senate. It already passed in the House, but they need 10 Republican senators to switch sides to pass it. So they're trying to sweeten the deal by saying, oh, well, we'll add a conscience amendment to it, to the bill, so that, there'll be like religious, and conscience protections in it. And most of the people are like, that is such an empty, worthless promise, because there already are religious and conscience protections for people under the First Amendment.
Right.
Why do we need a bill to say it? But unfortunately, the bill actually opens the door for, people who want to come and prosecute and persecute Americans of faith, because there's nothing in there that limits them. It just basically says you're going to accept the marriage as valid across the board from whatever state it was performed in and whatever kind of marriage it was.
Mm-hmm.
Where are their conscience protections there?
Right. And how what happens when some of these, same-sex proponents decide to knock on a Catholic church door and say, hey, we want to get married here. And the priest says, nope. And they turn right around, and what happens? From what I understand,
if anything, they're going to bog people down in lawsuits. I mean, my goodness, look at the what is it? The Masterpiece Cake Shop guy, the original guy who refused to bake the gay wedding cake. I took him years to win his case in front of the Supreme Court. And although he had people who, supported him, probably donated their legal time, people donated, toward his legal fees. I mean, can you imagine the cost to one individual trying to defend themselves against a discrimination lawsuit is?
Well, not only that, but we saw what happened when he was fundraising for coverage of his legal fees. Suddenly, PayPal and GoFundMe and some of these other crowdsourcing services and these financial online transaction services decided, you know what? We're not going to allow you to fundraise to cover your legal costs for this particular issue. We're not going to allow you to transfer money to take care of this particular issue for your legal costs, because it's immoral according to us. And so then you have not just a front going on with regard to the initial LGBT thing that you're fighting, but then you have to have a lawsuit going against these corporations who are discriminating against you, saying that you can't even fundraise or take the money that people have donated to you and use it in order to fuel your lawsuit. And it just it almost becomes a fractal where it just explodes exponentially in many different directions, where you're no longer able to fight on any front because you've got to fight on all fronts, and then they crush you.
Right. And of course, people who are against this amendment are saying, they pointed out, this is unnecessary legislation, because the only reason the Democrats proposed it in the first place is because they're quaking in their boots since Roe v. Wade got overturned.
Right.
They're terrified that the Supreme Court will overturn the gay marriage ruling. So they're trying to codify it into law. But as the opponents of this bill have pointed out, but all you're doing is affirming the status quo of same-sex marriage recognition established by the Supreme Court case. Again, they're terrified that, Obergefell will fall.
Yep.
And that's why they have to, shove this in. But they need those 10 Republicans.
Right. And they need to do it before the midterms because they know they're going to lose massively.
Yes, correct.
So it's a fight, and it's a fight that, it's got to be both and, right? We have to fight it in political grounds, but we also have to have the rosaries and the masses and the mass intentions and the worthy receptions of Holy Communion on behalf of those who need to stand firm against this incredible injustice and evil that is going to strike us hard if it's allowed to pass.
Of course, because the bill includes a private right of action against religious Americans, meaning it deputizes individuals to bring federal lawsuits against quote, so-called state agents who
Mm-hmm.
refuse to recognize same-sex marriages. So I don't know. Are people who head up religious organizations, are they considered agents of the state? Or are they just talking about people like Justice of the Peace when they say that? But the point is, people could sue you if you don't recognize their marriage.
Right. Yeah.
Or who knows? I mean, my goodness, depending on how evil people are getting, like, could they not just come in and say, well, you either have to marry everybody or you marry nobody, shut it down?
Right.
I mean, people might say, well, come on, that's a sort of an exaggerated, view of it. But my goodness, like, who thought we'd be where we are? In the beginning, the gay rights movement never said anything about marriage.
No, they just wanted to be tolerated.
They just wanted to be tolerated. They just wanted to be left alone. And
Then
then
they
it was
demanded
this.
to be accepted.
Right. And now we're at anybody who disagrees with this is hateful and awful and should be canceled. So why shouldn't we believe that we could get to a point where, assuming something like this gets codified into law, that they could come in and say, well, you either marry everybody or you marry nobody.
Right. Yep.
I mean, my goodness, we were at that Susan B. Anthony thing on Tuesday, excuse me, and we got cussed out on the streets by a complete stranger.
Right.
Just
Yep.
because we were going to a pro-life event.
Yep.
It wasn't who we are, what we did, anything that mattered. It was what we were supporting.
Yep.
And with hateful language, real angry people. Like, again, I don't think it's a stretch to think that if this amendment or this bill goes through, that people won't come after, with their knives sharpened.
Oh, yeah. I think that is coming. For sure, I think that's coming. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to get to some of these questions that people sent in, and I'll read them, and then we'll address them one at a time. This came in from Lucerne, who said, "Hi, Michael. Here's 2 to 3 important questions that I have to ask, or I have for you to answer. Last Sunday, after my parish's Novus Ordo Mass, I spoke to one of my friends who I thought was a devout conservative Catholic. We started discussing some topics. One was about a Catholic church flying a gay flag. I said, that's wrong. He said, no, it's okay to do that. Later, I read in the catechism that the homosexual inclination is objectively disordered and homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. He said being attracted to same-sex persons was okay as long as there was no sex. And a Catholic flag flying Catholic church flying the rainbow flag is okay because it just means that we care about homosexuals. Then I remembered I had printed out an article about a bishop who said a Catholic school cannot fly the gay flag or BLM flags. I couldn't find the article. Then I Googled the topic and found the story that a bishop was going to remove a Catholic status from a school that wouldn't take down the rainbow flag or the BLM flag. So I believe I'm right, and the bishop is right, and my friend is wrong. What do you think?
Yes, you are correct. You are right. Your friend is wrong.
Yes.
And there was a bishop that said, yes, he was going to remove the Catholic status of the school if they did not stop, or the name at least. They couldn't have the name Catholic in their school if they wouldn't stop flying the flags.
So then the question becomes, well, what is wrong? What is objectively wrong about flying the rainbow flag? And the objectivity in flying the rainbow flag has to do with 2 things. One, the flag is a symbol of homosexual sex. Okay, because it is. It's also a sign of homosexual identity. Identifying with something that is intrinsically disordered or identifying with an act that is intrinsically evil means that you are demeaning the imago Dei. You are demeaning the individual as an image of God, because God is not homosexual. There is no homosexuality in God. God does not make people gay. God does not create someone for the intention of same-sex attraction or same-sex activities. That is not possible in any of those things. And the rainbow flag is an indication of support for an ideology that goes directly against the intention of the marital act, the sexual act itself. It is intended for matrimony. It is intended to be between a man and a woman. If somebody has a sexual attraction towards somebody else of the same sex, it is a disorder of an extreme nature. It's the same kind of disorder that one would have if they thought that eating cyanide capsules is good for them. You wouldn't allow them to eat the cyanide capsules. So in the same respect, you wouldn't allow somebody to indulge in their homosexual inclinations. Furthermore, if somebody has a psychological disorder that says that they need to be eating cyanide capsules, you wouldn't say, well, it's okay. We need to have awareness day for those who have a desire to indulge in cyanide capsules. You know, obviously we don't want them to do it, but it's okay if they have pictures of cyanide capsules all over the place. And if they, you know, maybe even eat a cereal that says it's cyanidos or something like that. But, you know, it doesn't mean that we're actually giving them cyanide. First in intention, first in the mind, then in the will. Okay. If you keep something in your mind, it's eventually going to be acted out. That's how it always works. That's why in warfare, soldiers go out onto the field and they practice shooting. In fact, in World War I, they found that their soldiers who were crack shots were really good. They could shoot, you know, a bullseye from a very long distance, but they went out onto the battlefield and they weren't hitting anybody because they weren't conditioned to shoot a human person. So they started making black silhouette outlines of a human form with a bullseye on it so that they would shoot that. Therefore, they were able to condition them to shoot a person. The same principle applies towards those who have a same-sex inclination or transgender ideology or something along those lines. They feel like they have to do something. You are encouraging them in that identity, and therefore eventually they're going to do it. So that's what makes it evil.
Well, it also goes against all flag etiquette too.
Right.
Because for Pete's sake, why can't we fly a pirate flag now from the church or the
Right?
state house if we're going to fly rainbow flags?
Pirate flags.
Pirate flag. I mean, totally. I mean, seriously, state like flag etiquette. This is like goes all the way against it.
Yes,
And I
it
know
does.
people have problems like in Catholic churches when they have like the American flag on one side and the papal flag on the other. That people are like, oh, that's like the state inside the sanctuary. But it's like, at least there were rules that governed that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there were
Right.
supposed to be rules governing things that fly from official flagpoles too. You're not supposed
Right.
to be putting up a rainbow flag or a BLM flag anyway.
Right.
That goes against flag etiquette. And I know that's a minor point to your very eloquent theological analysis, but it just seems like nothing is sacred, not even
Nothing is sacred.
rules that people used to look to. It's like, oh, you know, there's a reason we're flying certain flags. Now people can fly whatever they want, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no structure.
So Lucerne has another question. She said, I told him the church doesn't baptize kids who have been adopted and raised by a same-sex couple. He doesn't think that's right. I told him the parents at the time of the child's baptism must declare they will raise the child in the Catholic faith. He said he doesn't remember that when he and his wife baptized their kids. He said it's better for the kid to be baptized by a same-sex couple than not. I think he's wrong on both parts. The church does require parents to agree to raise the child as Catholic and won't baptize children being raised by two homosexuals. So, and I can't see, is this a third question? Okay, that's a third question, which is different. So, in response to that, yes, when it comes to baptism, the parents are promising to raise the child Catholic, because if you baptize a child and then raise him as a Satanist, I mean, how awful! How awful would that be? And the same thing holds true for raising a child in a same-sex household. It might as well be the same thing, because it's a perversion of the truth. And it's such an inversion as to be diabolical. You might as well be raising the kid in a satanic household. So the church is very wise in denying baptism to a child being raised by a same-sex couple, because at least when the child is finally able to escape such a horrible situation, then the child will be able to be baptized, and in that instant have all of that sin washed away in a single moment, as opposed to having to carry it into the confessional and still having, all the other baggage that goes along with it. So the church is very wise not to baptize the children of same-sex couples.
Yeah, isn't there any, I mean, there is an argument though on some pastors that baptizing the baby at least gives them, I don't know, a fighting chance, if you will, in the future. The seed is being planted, so to speak. I'm not saying I ascribe to that, just that I have heard people say that.
Sure, that is a devil's argument. The corollary to that is that faith without works is dead, and the same holds true with baptism. If you start with the baptism, but then you give no substance to boost the child in raising them in the faith, then what you are ultimately doing is consigning that child to a life of debauchery without any foundation, and also the mark of baptism upon the child. So if the child were to fall into hell, the suffering would be so much greater than if the child had not been baptized. It's a strange way of looking at it, but it is true.
Wouldn't the argument be that the graces of the baptism might, in fact, in their life, prevent them from living that sort of debauchery?
But the graces of baptism can be wiped away pretty quickly, as we all know. Single mortal sin will do that. And if you are raising the child in a situation that is gravely sinful, then what you're doing is setting them up for a life of mortal sin on top of their baptism, which is awful.
Okay. Any other questions?
Let me see. I think that one is, I'll have to respond to some of the other there on my own. I think that, okay, so there is one more question. More and more priests are not following the exact words of the consecration of the Eucharist. Have Catholics become so conditioned to the lack of the mystery of transubstantiation that they no longer hear the words? That was a question from Claudia.
You mean the words of consecration?
Mm-hmm. And
does she have an example?
No, she didn't have an example, but I have heard that, yes, there are places where priests are starting to monkey with the words of transubstantiation or consecration. And of course, we've got these horrible examples of liturgical abuse. A couple of weeks ago, you had the priest in Italy who said mass on an inflatable float in the middle of the ocean, or on a beach area on the ocean, with a bunch of scantily clad people. And of course, the priest was in nothing but a pair of swim trunks with a stole draped over his neck. I mean, that was sacrilege. And then just recently, you had a case where a priest said mass on a bicycle, and he had a rainbow stole draped over his neck. And in the middle of mass, a wind kicked up, knocked the consecrated hosts onto the ground. And as the wind was carrying these consecrated hosts, the priest said, "Oh, Jesus is flying." I mean, it's really, really sacrilegious and blasphemous, and it's plain awful. And yet those priests are still priests in good standing, while good traditional Latin Mass priests are being sidelined because they refuse to say the Novus Ordo. Again, goes back to my original question. Are we being set up to have a fake church set up alongside a real church, all under the auspices of Big Tent Catholicism? Because it sure looks like we're going in that direction.
Yeah, but I would say to the person who posed the question that if they think they've heard people monkeying with the words of consecration, they need to document it. What church, yes, what priest, what mass, what date. Because it's one thing to throw out the kind of generalization. Oh, haven't people been noticing they've been monkeying the words with consecration, but without specific evidence, makes it really, I mean, because that's a pretty, we talked earlier about like sometimes the line isn't clear, the hill isn't clear because of the weaponized ambiguity, but that's a pretty clear one.
Yeah.
Like if you don't say, this is my body, this is my blood, then that's something you can go and take to your bishop, to the papal nuncio, whoever, but you have to document it. You have to get people who are, what?
Most people nowadays have one of these, and they all have video cameras on the back. So if you witness a priest doing something strange at Mass, record it.
Yeah, get people who are at least kindred souls that would be willing to testify that they saw or heard an abuse as well. I mean, that's what you have to do. Like, I think that it's very demoralizing to feel like you see abuses and just kind of toss them out there without really documenting where they occurred and what happened.
Right.
Because then you can actually do something about it, even if it's just to satisfy your own conscience that you did, in fact, try to do something about it, even if the higher ups ignore you.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for this evening. So why don't we go ahead and close with our prayer, and then we will see you all. Let's see, next week is the 23rd. You are going to be
I will not be on.
You will not be on. So it'll either be me flying solo or I will have a guest. We'll find out. Until then, why don't we go ahead and say our prayer? In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Our Lady of Victory,
pray for us.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, everybody. God bless you. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next Friday.